Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. We will get started here in just a minute. Okay, so it is 1 after 2 o'clock, 1 minute after 2 o'clock. So we will get started. Welcome to the Season of Creation webinar on biodiversity, uh, and conversation and policy. And please introduce yourselves and where your conservation, excuse me, and policy. Please introduce yourselves and where you're joining us from in the chat. And then please use the Q&A function, which is a little bit over from the chat function, as there will be time for questions at the end of the webinar. So my name is Lindsay Delks, and I handle domestic policy for the Office of Government Relations. The season of creation has officially begun, and as a part of the celebration of God's creation, we will be taking a closer look at the importance of conservation in addressing climate change, the federal policies that form the backbone of conservation in the United States, and what steps you can take in your own conservation journeys. I am so thrilled today to be joined by one of my colleagues, Susie Faria, who is a policy advisor with me in the Office of Government Relations, who focuses on our climate change, energy, and conservation policy for our office. And also Dr. Lisa Graumlich, Dean Emerita of the College of Environment at the University of Washington. She devoted her career to studying the causes and impacts of climate change. As a fellow of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the Ecological Society of America, and the Aldo Leopold Leadership Program, and past president of the American Geophysical Union. She brings forth decades of climate research to understand our changing planet. Reverend Graumlich was ordained as an Episcopal deacon in 2023 and now serves at St. Andrew's Episcopal Church in Tucson, Arizona. She chairs the Creation Care Council in the Diocese of Arizona. In this work, Reverend Graumlich bridges the worlds of rigorous science and sacred ministry to support an equitable, sustainable earth where all people thrive. Once again, thrilled to have both of you here today. So, Elisa, I will begin with you. You have spent your life immersed in science and now more recently as a clergy member, building bridges with communities of faith. In terms of biodiversity, how do you see science and the call to care for creation linked?
Lindsay, thank you so much for that introduction. And I am actually thrilled to see these chats come in and see that we have got an interesting audience and gathering here today, because I recognize some of my dear science colleagues, as well as many people from the Episcopal Church and the faith community. So we are gathering here as people called to care for God's creation, but also as concerned citizens and scientists that may be exploring, what does faith mean in this context? So very, very warm welcome to everyone. I'm actually really touched, particularly from some of longtime colleagues and friends. So given this range of people that we have today, I think I want to open with what is uniting us, which is a deep, deep sense of urgency in the face of ongoing threats to biodiversity. And of course, I'm a scientist and a professor, so I got to define some terms. And when we say biodiversity, we mean the variety of life at all levels: genetic diversity within a species, species diversity within ecosystems, ecosystem diversity within landscapes and globally. And notice it's not just about cute and charismatic animals, not discounting cute and charismatic animals. I have ones I love myself, but it's about this complex set of relationships that keep our planet habitable. So I want to state unequivocally that biodiversity, this intricate web of relationships, so when you hear biodiversity, think relationships, is what is truly stabilizing the Earth's planetary conditions, making life itself possible. So as a clergy member, I also define terms. And so for the uninitiated, we're going to talk a few churchy terms here. People of faith talk about ministries. And that's basically a way in which we talk about how we engage with the world outside of the church. And really am honored to be part of the Episcopalian tradition that has offices of government relations and has long history of a very public kind of witness. So among Christian faiths, not just the Episcopalians, this week is very special because it starts about a month-long season of creation where collectively we are pausing globally to think about creation and how we take action in caring for the natural world. So at this moment in time, we are called to think about this creation care ministry as not just a couple of sermons or maybe an adult forum and a coffee hour. There's a big calling here we're going to get to at the end. But we need to be prophets of hope. We need to be eager learners. You're doing that today, and educators and catalysts for transformation. So with ministry, we help our communities understand that caring for creation is not like an optional activism thing you might do in your spare time, but in our faith tradition, it is essential discipleness. It is rooted in our baptismal covenant to, quote, strive for justice and peace among all people and respect the dignity of every human being, including future generations who will inherit the earth we leave behind. So one last piece about this ministry, it's not just about the most pristine of pristine places. It is also the polluted neighborhoods where environmental injustice falls heavily on poor and marginalized people. So creation care and social justice are inseparable. So in my view, science and faith need to walk arm in arm on this journey because the rift in our spiritual relationship to creation is a great threat to the earth. It's as great a threat as fossil fuel consumption, I would argue. And I've got good authorities to back me up. So this is my copy of Pope Francis's encyclical Laudato Si. And one of my favorite quotes is, he writes somewhere in the middle there, that the external deserts in the world are growing because the internal deserts have become so vast. And he goes on to write shortly after that, a healthy relationship with creation requires, in the first instance, acknowledging where we have gone wrong. It entails the recognition of our errors, our sins, our faults, and failures. So in this introductory beat, I want to talk about where have we gone wrong. And it's a truly astonishing scale of loss. You know these, but I'm just going to mention a few of them. Since 1970, not that long ago, North America has lost 3 billion birds. That's 1 in 4 birds that are gone. 40% of our insect species are in decline globally, which is threatening pollination systems that support our food supply. In the US, we lose natural habitat at about 6,000 acres per day to development right now. So why does it matter? Like I'm looking at my window, I can see birds. There's birds out there. Like there's birds. Like, why are we worrying about birds? The bird loss signals ecosystem collapse. Birds are literally like, they're not like, they're the canaries in the coal mine for entire ecosystems. When we lose 3 billion with a B birds, this is what we're seeing. So it can cause insect population explosions. So that sweet little chickadee you might see at your feeder, that chickadee, when it's not eating at your feeder, eats 350 to 600 caterpillars per day during breeding season. So when we have fewer birds, we have more crop pests and forest defoliators. We see a breakdown in pollination. Hummingbirds pollinate over 8,000 plant species. 8,000. And as these numbers drop, so does plant reproduction. Okay, then this harbinger of bad news part of the talk. There's the insect apocalypse, as I like to call it, which is like the foundation crumbling around us. There's a 40% decline in insect species. And that, quite frankly, is an ecological catastrophe. It's a pollination crisis. Here's something you might not have thought of. It's a decomposition crisis. Insects decompose organic matter and recycle nutrients. And without them, forests become choked with dead matter and nutrients are locked away. So all of this is happening more and more rapidly. So this crisis, this urgency you hear in my voice is the fact that each lost species makes other species more vulnerable. So we're not just losing individual species, we are losing these relationships. So that is why every acre of habitat we protect, every native plant we restore, every pollinator garden we create matters here. And in a time of breakdown, every act of healing becomes exponentially more important. So this requires a huge change of heart and also a robust dose of policy. And with that, I get to turn it over to my colleague, Susie. Actually, I think Lindsay, I'm turning it over to you. I do know what I'm doing.
Thank you so much, Dr. Graumlich, for that level setting and overview. And I will turn it over to Susie for kind of our federal policy overview.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent place to kind of set the stage of what we're going to kind of further discuss along the way throughout the hour. But to give kind of some of the US federal context, the US federal government is the largest landowner in the United States, and it controls over 640 million acres, which is a little less than 30% of the country. The US is just huge. So it controls a lot of land, but it's still only about 30%. And that land that they own is not all used for conservation purposes. It's also used for military bases. There's the National Park Service. There's lots of different uses for those public lands. We also have a foundation of over 130 different laws related to conservation. Obviously, I do not have time to talk about all of them. Some of them are more granular than others, and some are very broad sweeping. For instance, the establishment of the national park system was done through legislation. We also have the Federal Land and Policy Management Act, the Clean Water Act, Coastal Wetlands Planning, Protection and Restoration Act, Endangered Species Act, Fish and Wildlife Act, National Wildlife Refuge System Act, Land and Water Conservation Fund Act. The list goes on and on. It's also important to know, and I was observing who is joining us today, that the land that the government controls is not it is not evenly dispersed throughout all 50 states. The western states and the western part of the United States have the US government controls far more of their lands than in the eastern half of the country. I don't think that's going to be surprising to anyone. But it is important to note, for instance, the US government has less than 5% of the lands controlled in Connecticut, but they control over 95% of Alaska, right? And so that's just a uneven distribution for that, in terms of the federal government. And all of these policies, these over 130 laws, they all direct federal agencies to help with various things, including conservation efforts. And so we have the Department of the Interior being one of the largest parts of the federal government in charge of this, and the Environmental Protection Agency. And then under the Department of Interior, or DOI, as they are often abbreviated to, is the Fish and Wildlife Service, the National Park Service, the U.S. Forest Service, and the Bureau of Land Management, which controls a very, very large swath of lands. It's also really important to note that this has historically been an incredibly bipartisan area. It is something where massive conservation legislation has passed under both Democratic and Republican leaders. So it is not something that is as partisan or has historically been partisan in the United States. And I think that's a really important thing to remember as a nonpartisan organization ourselves. And as Lisa mentioned, taking care of conserving and taking care of our lands is incredibly important to human health as well. We are not separate from our environment or vice versa. Lisa mentioned environmental justice communities, and we see the really harmful effects, especially for Black and Brown communities, of them having to live close to petrochemical plants, to poisoned waterways, closer to energy sources that are spewing pollution, or to poisoned waters, things like that. There's lots of different ways to be an environmental justice community. It's a pretty all-encompassing term, but people are suffering too. I think we often try to separate ourselves from that. And this very much goes against the way that Indigenous communities often live and have historically lived. And as we have removed ourselves, we have also created a harsher environment, or we see areas like the National Park System as something that needs to be completely separated from people, where the idea that if we influence or care for it or something will somehow ruin it, as if we are completely separated. And I think that this is reflected in federal policies, but it's also just untrue. We can be really careful and good stewards of this planet. And I think that the Clean Water Act is a great example of that in terms of federal policy. It is a massive piece of legislation that really helped to protect, clean up, and restore waterways, and really work to protect clean drinking water, as well as lakes, rivers, streams, everything. And so policy can be really effective for these types of things, but there is also a rethinking that needs to take place as we continue to talk about conservation. I do want to talk about some of the recent changes. I'm sure many of you are aware of H.R. 1's passage that was signed into law on July 4th of this year. There are large swaths of oil and gas leasing, both onshore and offshore, that are required under this new law. The offshore gas leases are in the Gulf of Mexico, as well as the Cook Inlet of Alaska. There's 4 mandated lease sales in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge before 2032. There's also been overturning in certain restrictions on the amount of land that can be leased to oil and gas sales. There's mandatory quarterly onshore oil and gas lease sales on public lands in Wyoming, New Mexico, Colorado, Utah, Montana, North Dakota, Oklahoma, Nevada, and Alaska. And all of these things are incredibly detrimental to the environment that we are hoping to conserve and to protect for the biodiversity, and also for us as a species on this planet. There's also been rollbacks around forestry and the logging industry that I don't think have been getting quite as much fanfare, with many forests now being open for logging and development to be cleared or to just be logged for the purposes of the logging industry, which can also be incredibly harmful. There's one rule that I wanted to highlight as well, besides for H.R. 1. This is an administrative rule change from the previous administration. So under the Biden administration, a new public lands rule was implemented, and it allowed for the Bureau of Land Management to weigh conservation and restoration as equally valid uses as industrial practices under what's called the multi-use mandate. And historically, industrial activity like drilling and mining and logging have always received more access to public lands when in the leasing process. And this change, this public rule, was meant to remedy that and put conservation on the same footing as those industrial developments. And it really was supposed to close that gap, essentially. The Trump administration has made it clear that of its intent to rescind this rule and revert things back to their prior disparity. And because the leasing process can just take a very, very long time, this is not something that can be done overnight. It means that any of the potential folks who were hoping to lease these lands for the sake of conservation and restoration will no longer get the initial benefit that they were hoping to under the previous rule. So that's something that's very important to note, and also not something that has gotten quite as much fanfare. There's also been congressional discussions around amending the Endangered Species Act, making it easier to remove species that have recovered more or have more stable populations than they once did. And the big takeaway is, in terms of this year, is that recent developments are not supporting new conservation efforts and are working to reduce funding and access for conservation efforts across the country. So that's the place to. I'll let that be as the overview. So back to you, Lindsay.
Thank you so much, Susie, for that federal policy overview. Lisa, turning back to you, how do conservation acts serve to care for creation, and are there any specific examples, especially as it relates to climate change?
So, Lindsay, I'm going to get to that in a second, but I want to acknowledge I'm not catching all of the chat, but it goes flying by my screen. And I noticed some really rich conversations about what does ownership of land mean, sort of in this discussion, and then in sort of the broadest sort of possible framing of it. And I'm looking at Susie, I'm looking at you. I think I want to put a pin in the fact that it will be really interesting to go back to that chat. And I think it is worthy of potentially more conversations, because if you think about land tenure, as a social scientist was talking about, it's both about ownership, it's about bundles of rights, who gets to do what on land. And there are so many different models of how land is cared for and shared, coming out of both our own indigenous traditions as well as globally. And so that is a very strong underpinning of all that we do. So, thank you for those of you in the chat that are elevating that, with including the land back movement within the Native American community. But Lindsay, I didn't forget your question. So it was example of conservation actions, and I love the fact that Susie brought up the way in which, quite frankly, I had felt like we had gone so far to preserve forests, particularly old growth. As a Westerner, this is such a legacy for our children's children's children. And as somebody that studies very old trees, we're talking about trees that are 500 to 1,000 years old, something that is incredibly special. And I think of them not just as beautiful trees. I'm going to suggest they are carbon cathedrals. So old growth forests can store like over 200 tons of carbon per acre. Okay, now, if that doesn't immediately translate into anything meaningful to you, that is the equivalent of taking 430 cars off the road for an entire year. That's just in 1 acre. And one of our most majestic trees, the Douglas fir, it can hold a single Douglas fir can hold as much carbon as a car produces driving 48,000 miles. So when we're talking about losing even an acre of these forests, it is something that previously we have been depending on to counteract the emission of our fossil fuels, and we are potentially throwing that carbon away. We are re-releasing it to the atmosphere in a way that will simply make climate change and threats to biodiversity all the more. Farther away from home, the Amazon rainforest. stores about 200 billion tons of carbon. And that is more than 10 times the annual global emissions from all human activities. So losing just 1% of the Amazon releases as much as CO2 as adding 25 million cars to the road. So, people talk about forests as being sort of the lungs of the planet because, they're literally breathing for us, taking in CO2 and storing it, releasing it as oxygen. But they are doing it in ways that is absolutely critical to stabilizing the Earth's climate system. So I'm a Midwesterner. One of the things I love to see in the Midwest that I abandoned is prairie restoration. There is so little native prairie left. And converting farmland or other land in different uses back to native grassland is a not trivial task, but it is absolutely doable. And it is so incredibly important for carbon. So native prairie plants, things like big bluestem and switchgrass, have these root systems. I mean, some of you have seen this, like these pictures of what's above ground and then like 15 feet of root. That's like 3 of me going down into the soil. And all that deep root system stores more carbon below ground than is above. And so when it's restored, you can store 3 tons of carbon per acre while supporting 200 species of birds and butterflies and other wildlife. And within the Episcopal Church, we really have a eco-hero here in the person of Bishop Kathleen Chittenden Bascom, who has been a leading, not just voice, but a leading like roll up her sleeves and get dirty on prairie restoration and talking about it as a spiritual practice. I mean, one of the things I love about how she does this, she talks about how restoring native grasslands on church properties, and we have these properties all over the prairie areas, creates what she calls thin spaces where the sacred becomes visible and it connects congregations to the land as well as serving climate goals. And she also emphasizes that prairie restoration is it's not a quick fix. It teaches patience and hope because it can take up to 5 years or more to establish a restored prairie, but then it provides these benefits for decades. So, Lindsay, I could go on and on. I'm going to stop there so we can go back to Susie and we have time for a Q&A.
Thank you so much for that. Susie, I will pass it back to you just to give us an overview of terminology that's helpful in this policy kind of conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. Dr. Graumlich already explained some of the great terms that we need for this, but I also want to explain some of the more policy-focused ones as well, just because they get thrown out a lot, and then I don't think everybody pauses to be like, well, what does that actually mean in this context? And so we'll start with some UN terms that have been adopted in policy spheres. So 30 by 30 is a good place to start. This is the goal of having 30% of lands reserved for conservation by the year 2030, so 5 years from now. This is a term that's part of the Sustainable Development Goals, and it's one that the Episcopal Church has actually endorsed. It was also something that the previous presidential administration had been working to support, which is part of the reason for that public lands rule change. The current administration is much less friendly to the UN's ideologies at this point. There's also the term adaptation, which gets thrown around a lot. So adapting to our, quote, new normal with climate change, it's already really begun. So how do we adapt in this moment to deal with those consequences, right? And so it can have a broad meaning with conservation, from everything from the habitat restoration that Lisa's talking about, as well as doing things like planting more trees in cities to help with canopy cover to prevent sidewalks from getting as hot, or planting native plants in your garden, things like that. There's lots of ways to adapt. Mitigation is another term that gets thrown around a lot. So working to prevent the worst effects of climate change. And so this is often used when referring to reducing greenhouse gases, but it can be broader than that. But another UN term. Loss and damage, which refers to areas that are too damaged or no longer habitable due to climate change. So this refers to areas that have experienced severe sea level rise, repeated storms, extreme drought, desertification, things like that. They're areas that are just no longer fit for human settlement for one of many reasons. Moving away from some of the more UN heavy terms, I wanted to mention nature-based solutions, which is a term that gets thrown out a lot. And that's a kind of a catch-all term that's used to describe restoring natural resources to help combat climate change. So this is where the restoration that Lisa was just talking about comes in. But it's all, you've talked about it in the prairie context, which is an excellent thing that I don't think gets enough attention. But there's also the coastal version of that. I know that Florida has been considering doing work of restoring mangroves that have been removed because mangroves are incredibly important ecosystems for protecting exposed coastlines and preventing sea level rise, dampening the effects of hurricanes, as well as preventing coastal erosion. And then planting native plants can also help with things like that. Lisa was talking about storage of carbon, but there's also water storage. So I live in DC. DC is a literal swamp. It's not just a fun nickname. And they've started in places replanting the swamp plants here to help with the flooding risks that have begun to happen because of the lack of those plants. And those help with preventing the sidewalks and streets from getting flooded, as well as help with pollinators and things like that that are essential for biodiversity. I also just wanted to take a note on endangered species because you all have heard this one. Lisa already talked about the cute and cuddly kind of endangered species that we are all very familiar with, but also that it can be referred to for plants and fungi as well. This is not just the Animalia kingdom. This is also plantae and fungi as well. And also insects, because again, they're not quite as cute. They're not the poster children, but they are incredibly vital in these conversations. And the endangered species list specifically, I believe there's about 4,000 species currently listed on the endangered species list, which gets updated on a pretty regular basis. And there are species that have made recoveries. I don't, a lot of this is very heavy, but there are ways to actually prevent these species from going extinct. And I want that to be a main takeaway. And then I do want to just do a broad reminder that many terms like conservation plan, environmental impact, watershed, etc., they all have specific federal definitions that may differ from how they are used colloquially. So representatives, officials, scientists, they will all use those words slightly differently or have a more strict definition than how we might use them as more like public citizens or the general public. And it's just something to be aware of as we talk about advocacy and things like that going forward, which we'll get to in a little bit.
Thank you, Susie, for that helpful overview. Lisa, I'll turn it back to you just to ask, how can communities of faith come together to really meet this moment?
Oh, Lindsay, I don't think a day goes by that I don't either say or hear meeting this moment. And this moment is kind of attenuating for months and months. And every so often I stop and I ask myself, like, what do you mean, Lisa? Like when you say this thing. And I think I know what I mean. I'm going to share this. And this is like my first public sharing of my version of Meet the Moment. So you have to tell me if you buy this. Okay. Recall, we've got people of faith here. I think this is an Esther moment. Okay, for those of you whose Hebrew Bible knowledge is a little hazy, the book of Esther tells about a young Jewish woman who found herself unexpectedly in a position of influence during a time of great existential threat to her people. So her cousin Mordecai, we all have these cousins, urges her to speak to the king on behalf of the Jews. And she hesitates. It's dangerous. It's not her role. Someone else could do it. And he was one of those kind of cousins. He didn't let it go. And he says, who knows? Perhaps you have come to royal dignity for just such a time as this. Doesn't that resonate? So here we are. We're in our Esther moment. We've got federal environmental protection retreating, as Susie has talked about. We've got climate change accelerating. We have biodiversity facing an unprecedented threat. And like Esther, we could very well feel that creation care isn't really our calling as a church. Can't the scientists handle that for us, please? Or maybe the politicians? Surely the NGOs, the nonprofits got this under control. Or perhaps God has placed us as people of faith in this moment for this purpose. I have data. I don't just like say these things. So think about this. Think about all the resources that God has provided to the church. We own, and that's in quotes, folks, we own millions of acres of land across America. We have church buildings. We have camps. We have retreat centers. We have cemeteries. We have moral authority that transcends political divisions. People will listen to religious voices even when they dismiss political ones. And we have a theology that runs deeper than any policy. Our call to care for creation doesn't change with the electoral cycle. We have networks that reach every community. It's rural, it's urban, it's red states, it's blue states. We have stuff. So Esther had to choose between staying safe and silent or risking everything for her people. We face a similar choice: stay focused on our traditional church or recognize that creation care is discipleship, it's loving our neighbors, it is following Christ. And so we can be faithful to the moment that God has given us. Timing is everything. Esther didn't have time to wait. She couldn't wait for a better moment, a safer moment, a more convenient moment. Creation care is not going to wait for a perfect federal policy with the perfect configuration of the different branches of our government at federal, state, and local levels. This is the time we wished for by any sense, but it is the time we've been given. Now, last bit about Esther. There was the cousin, but she was alone. She asked all the Jews to fast and pray with her. We are not called to save creation single-handedly, but to act faithfully alongside others. And when federal policy retreats from conservation, state governments, local communities, faith groups, and individuals absolutely must step forward.
Thank you so much for that, Dr. Graumlich. Susie, I can turn back to you and just ask, with kind of everything happening at the federal level, what are some ways that communities can be effective outside of the federal government?
Absolutely. Again, I just want to reiterate, the federal government controls less than 30% of US lands. That is still a lot of land, but it is not the majority by any means. And advocacy can still go a very long way. And I think right now, state and local advocacy is an incredibly important tool. We always say that. We say that while our mandate as the Office of Government Relations is to represent the church to the federal government, that is not in exchange for state and local action from Episcopalians or from anyone. These are still very active ways that you can be involved. And states are often doing a lot that they could use support for outside of the federal government, especially in times like these when there's been such dramatic changes to the way things have been. I think I saw earlier somebody commented about lawns and how grass as an invasive species is really bad for biodiversity. You're absolutely correct. I remember during the pandemic seeing a lot of no-mow laws put in place in towns, and they saw pollinator rises. So there's opportunity in those types of ways, even in just your town. These do not have to be widespread things. Or if you have a lawn, plant your native species, work with your neighbors, see if they're willing to put in something like butterfly milkweed or something that would benefit more than just the kind of, in my opinion, slightly sterile aesthetic of just a perfectly green lawn. There's also opportunity for local and state parks as well to turn those into like native species only planting. I know that I'm from Massachusetts, and the Trustees Association has been doing a lot with planting native species and restoring grasslands as trees and things like that. As a state that kind of lost all of its trees and then started growing them back, it's really amazing to see that type of restoration take place. From the church side of things, churches are a great resource. Even if your church is urban, there's still kind of outdoor pieces, or maybe you can work with your city to, or your city to help plant in a park, or put a rooftop garden on, or something unique. I think there's a lot of room for real creativity in these spaces that I don't think should be overlooked or kind of underappreciated either. We talk about this in general, and a lot of what Lisa has been talking about in terms of tying your faith into these types of practices. And in how we kind of describe it from our office is in our Faith and Citizenship Guide, which we really publicize during election season, which it is, even if it is in quote off year, there are still elections going on around the country. And the Faith and Citizenship Guide kind of talks about exactly why, as people of faith, we participate in advocacy and federal advocacy, and also state and local advocacy. And so we'll make sure to share that in our follow-up resources if you are looking for some more language around that. These tools that we offer as the Office of Government Relations can be adapted for state and local. Just because we are not following the bills in every state around conservation law or energy policy or whatever related to care of creation doesn't mean that there aren't tools available to you. And we have a couple of organizations that actually do that will also be in the follow-up email to help you figure out what's going on at your state and local level. And then I also just want to highlight that, and I think other people are highlighting this in the comments as well, is that there's strength in numbers. We're not alone in this. And I think there's an opportunity to find allies in places that maybe you didn't realize that they could exist before. We often work in coalition with groups that we are not fully aligned with on certain topics that we are. And so something that I often am looking at in my research around states and who might be willing to talk to their representatives about an issue is things like hunting and fishing clubs. They are often huge in conservation efforts because that is what they're doing. They're out in the open, they're out in the wilderness, and they're out in parks, forests, etc., to have these hobbies. And so see where you might align with that. And I also think that needs to be a bit of rethinking around conservation in general. Nobody wants to cut down a tree, but sometimes it's necessary if that tree is an invasive species, or if that tree is growing in a place that should be a wetland or a prairie. And so I think we also can really learn a lot from what our ecosystems used to look like and bringing those back rather than just saying there's never a reason to ever cut down a tree, which I realize it doesn't feel good, right? Nobody wants to do that. But I think there needs to be a real rethinking of how restoration really works in terms of rebuilding and restoring ecosystems, as Lisa was discussing earlier. Again, there will be lots of resources in the follow-up. Emily, I see you just posted climate exchange. That is also included in there. But yes, I think that's it for me for now.
Thank you so much for that, Susie. And Lisa, I'll ask you kind of a similar question. What can local parishes do to be engaged in this work?
Well, we've touched on a lot of them. And I think one of the things that I like that is bubbling up in the chat, once again, Susie and I are going to be taking a deep dive into looking at all of those comments, is being strong advocates and not working alone. And so in every community, in every parish, the most likely partners are probably well known. I guess I would challenge all of you is to, in the season of creation, do some deep thinking about what the unlikely partner might be that will take a bit more effort. Is that because of different economic situations or cultural situations or a little bit of distance or whatever? But, think about how strong coalitions are ones that actually have true diversity in them, a little like what we were talking about, biodiversity sort of stabilizes the planet. So once again, taking care of what we actually have in our resource base, all of the kinds of properties, et cetera, pollinator pathways, et cetera. Actually, I haven't seen it, but I've actually heard that Trinity Church, Wall Street, has a rooftop garden with native pollinators on. Somebody going to give me a thumbs up? See, I actually can't see you guys. I heard that on good sources. So even the most urban of urban places, there's a possibility. But when we think about sort of restoration, that's where some of the partnerships come in, whether it's stream cleanups, tree planting. Tree planting is a social justice issue because often tree canopy cover really sort of follows the same map as the redlining of previous decades where poorer communities have less tree cover and less. Here we are, speaking to you from Tucson, where that becomes so critical for surviving in the deep heat. Invasive species removal. You can never have enough work parties going after invasive species, and all of which, I think one of the things about all of this is, in this moment, it's a huge antidote to the hopelessness that we can feel. So roll up your sleeves.
Thank you both. We'll now turn to some questions from some the attendees. I'll go with this first one. It says many, if not most, of our conservation models were developed during the late 19th and early 20th century. And while some may be successful, which ones do you think could use some improvement? And they point to countries like Rwanda, Costa Rica, Norway, and Germany, who have modern approaches to conservation. And what are some contemporary models that we should be examining?
Lisa, I don't know if you, that's
you know what,
yeah.
I don't know who asked that question, but I have to say that a dear friend and colleague, I believe, is in this audience who, because of his leadership at Yellowstone National Park, afforded me the opportunity to spend a great deal of time in East Africa and the Serengeti ecosystem, where very different models of conservation were in place, many of which had roots deep, 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 from time immemorial, that had to do with how people and livestock lived together and thrived together. And with my colleagues' help, actually, Glenn Plum, you're out there someplace, we were able to spark conversations in the incredibly complex social and political sphere of the greater Yellowstone ecosystem about what those models could mean for what happens when bison walk out of Yellowstone National Park, and what is the role of Indigenous people in terms of stewarding and caring for a landscape that has these long, long, long millennial histories in them. So thank you. I don't know who asked the question, but thank you so much, because there is so much more to learn. And I think enshrining, somebody that's in higher education, when I started my career, that North American conservation model was taught to our students and held up as the global model. The good news is it's a much more dynamic conversation now.
Thank you for that, Lisa, because this is an excellent question that I don't have a firm answer for. I do think policy in general is something that builds on itself and evolves over time. And I think there's always opportunities for that, regardless of the area that you're talking about. And that includes conservation efforts. And I think you're a professor, right? I think education is so key to this in terms of helping people understand why this model is not ideal, or why it may have seemed like a good idea at the time, or why it was adopted, but maybe it doesn't fit the moment now. And I think that education around that is still fairly limited. I'm very glad that there is more awareness that I believe there was 50, 60, 70 years ago, but there's always room for growth and education in that and where there's education kind of understanding of things, there's room for kind of evolving our perspective and then working that into policy that better suits our needs.
We have another question that says, as a church, how do we engage the urgent work of care for creation, advocacy, and action to preserve biodiversity while also making space for the slow, contemplative, and prayerful work of attending to, engaging with, and honoring creation as more than a sort of abstract wounded mass in need of human-driven, quote unquote, salvation?
I'll start. Thank you for that question, because we can't do this work without not just the creation care, but the self-care and the community care that involves prayerful approaches to contemplating our situation, that involves both massive joy and praise for the beauty of divine creation and massive lament, collective lament about how we have come to this place. And so it is, I just love that question, because I think it's, you've been hearing from me all this, like, roll up your sleeves, get out there, plant some prairie plants. And, and importantly, stay centered with why you are doing this and why this is your calling and sharing that. Sometimes it's, particularly when we're outside of or on the edges of our sort of faith communities, talking about this kind of thing can be hard. And I think it's one of the key things is being able to talk about the lament and joy with others that don't necessarily aren't part of our closer community. I love that question.
I personally get a lot of prayer. I guess I like to move in general. I love hiking. I love being outdoors. I love going for just a really long walk or gardening or all sorts of things that I see as care for creation. And I think, the Episcopal tradition often sees prayer as being a pretty stagnant thing. We're sitting in pews or we're kneeling or we're clasping our hands and bowing our heads. And that's wonderful. I've always loved those moments as well. But I think that prayer can be broader than that. And to me, I think those movement and the gardening or whatever it is I'm doing that makes me feel connected with the earth is also a form of prayer for me. I don't expect that to be the case for everybody. I also just want to highlight, I see some really wonderful diocesan dialogue and what your diocese or your parishes are doing in the chat. And also Bishop Bascom is with us, and she posted some information about the eco regions that is an upcoming, or it's a newly launched program that she will be spearheading. So I would recommend, if you want to go outside of just your individual parish, that's a potential opportunity for you as well. So yeah.
And I think this is a really interesting question. Not to say all of them have been interesting, but I'm really interested to hear the answer for this one. So it says, as we work to reduce the impact of climate change through nature-based solutions, we often focus rightfully so on land. What role can and do the oceans play, and how can we support those efforts?
I'll start if that's okay, Susie. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So Susie mentioned a couple of ways in which coastal places, how DC really is a swamp, or I think technically and sort of really an estuary, part very close to the Chesapeake Bay estuary, et cetera, where when we actually do conservation actions there, we are taking up a lot of carbon. There was a chat mentioning about eelgrass restoration as another way of sequestering carbon and supporting biodiversity in marine systems. And of course, there's the incredibly important way in which mangrove restoration in coastal areas, including our own, sort of Florida and Southeast US coast, but certainly in tropical areas, is so important because of not just carbon, but sort of they're sort of fish nurseries. It's where sort of supports vibrant and healthy fisheries. And then in the case of sea level rise and severe storms, it protects coastal areas. And so marine-based conservation is incredibly important. A sort of watch this space, not this space, but people are looking to oceans as a site for carbon sequestration in ways that are anywhere from relatively simple to highly technical, and burial of carbon on sea floors, et cetera, et cetera. So the role of the ocean is both a really rich opportunity as well as a contested space where I think the moral authority and sort of ethical frameworks of a community of faith really need to weigh in.
And to add to that as well, from the more colder water perspective, which is where I'm from as well, mussels and oysters and other types of bivalves are absolutely crucial for a lot of ecosystems, especially in cooler weather areas. They filter the water around them. They help keep the oceans and the shorelines cleaner by association, and restoring them, not just for the purposes of eating, which I have no judgment of anybody who loves their oyster, but I grew up around that. But those are incredibly important species. And I think there's a lot of ways to kind of get involved in supporting those restoration efforts if you are not in a place that is mangrove friendly, but still on the coast. There's also very interesting, I have yet to find a lot of big kind of projects like this, but there is some invasive species management projects that I've seen for ocean and marine life species. So for instance, off the coast of Florida, there's a lionfish population that should not be there because lionfish are native to Southeast Asia, not the Florida. And that has caught, they're eating everything. And so there are diving groups who just go out and they spearfish for lionfish. And that's how they're helping to manage things like that. So there's also issues like the Mississippi River has carp in it that are not supposed to be there. Carp's edible, right? Like there are certain ways that I think, yes, invasive crabs, like these are all populations that oftentimes can be eaten. And so if you know a fishing group, I would build a partnership with them, see what they can do, see where that could go, in addition to like working for things like kelp forest restoration or seagrass, which is something that is quite incredibly important in marshes and along the coastline where I grew up as well. So there's a lot of opportunity and a lot of kind of occasionally very niche sounding ideas that you can do to work with this.
Thank you both so much for those answers. We did have a ton of questions, but unfortunately we have 1 minute until the end of the webinar. But we will have our EPPN email and the resource follow-up. If there are any pressing questions that you guys have, please feel free to reach out to us directly. I want to thank my colleague Susie and Reverend Dr. Graumlich for joining us and sharing your expertise, and all of you for joining us and talking about all the wonderful things that you're parishes and dioceses are doing for the season of creation. And we hope that this is a conversation that we can continue to be having as it becomes more and more relevant. I'm not sure if there's any last thoughts that either of you want to share.
If I can, we did not
Please.
script this. I'm a deacon, and the churchy people here know what deacons do at the end. So may I dismiss us?
Please.
Go forth, enjoy a beautiful creation filled weekend, and care for your Mother Earth. Thank you.
Thank you.